It was the last days of the administration of US President Dwight Eisenhower. On December 13, 1960, Time magazine alerted the world. Israel was secretly building an atomic bomb. The commotion was big. Nobody wanted to know anything about it. Had Eisenhower not always pronounced himself against a nuclear power in the Middle East? The International Atomic Energy Agency in Vienna, founded only 3 years earlier, whose main task is the prevention of the military use of atomic energy, remained silent until today. The Time article was based on a report by scientist Henry Gomberg, who on his return from Israel had reported to the US Energy Commission, the AEC, about a secret nuclear facility in the Negev Desert. There, in Dimona, plutonium was produced. How did the young state manage this? To calm the public, the State Department called the Israeli ambassador. He had to explain how his tremendous project was financed, since there was no item for it in the official budget, largely supported by the United States. His answer is not included in the records, at least not in the declassified ones. The international community and the parliaments were systematically lied to. The truth is that already in 1960, Western governments knew about the Israeli nuclear project. They had authorized and supported the construction of this weapon of mass destruction. The Israeli atomic bomb was built with German money and German technology. The technology was developed by scientists Carl Friedrich von Weizsäcker, Otto Hahn, and Karl Wirtz at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute in Berlin during World War II, in the name of the Führer Adolf Hitler. Their knowledge was put at the service of Israel since the late 1950s. The heavy water came from Norway, where the Nazis had produced it during the war. The uranium was supplied with the consent of the United States by the Argentine Atomic Commission, which was created after 1945 with the assistance of Nazi scientists. In the 1930s, almost no other country had research on nuclear fission as advanced as Germany. With the beginning of World War II, the Nazi government submitted the civilian research to its military purpose. They needed this decisive weapon for the final victory, the atomic bomb. And almost all the scientists were subordinated to this plan. And they agreed. They were able to continue working and did not have to go to the front. The investigation progressed on 2 lines. The official one was developed in the Uranverein, the Uranium Club, with internationally recognized scientists such as Werner Heisenberg, von Weizsäcker, and Wirtz of the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute of Physics, Paul Hartek and William Groth of the University of Hamburg, as well as Kurt Diebner of the Army Ordnance. Line 2 was under the command of SS General Hans Kammler. Its mission was to develop rockets and nuclear explosive in Thuringia, in underground facilities and with prisoners of concentration camps. The plan was absolutely secret. Not even the Uranverein knew about its existence, says a document from the company Degussa, whose archives I was allowed to see.
Dr. Wirtz does not know that in addition to him, other entities also receive uranium metal for scientific research.
The distribution lists names the accounting department and the special accounting department. Both German lines wanted to produce plutonium from natural uranium and heavy water, and not, like the US Manhattan Project did, from enriched uranium. The natural uranium was supplied by Degussa, the company that processed gold and silver, and that during the Third Reich processed and sold the gold teeth of the murdered Jews. In 1944, it supplied 5.5 tons of uranium metal. The raw material came from Saxony and was processed by Degussa. They called it special metal for camouflage. A few weeks before the end of the war, the plants producing the special metal were moved to Thuringia. Degussa did not agree to this, but had to carry out the orders. The heavy water was produced in Norway. During the war, after the German occupation of Norway, the chemical company IG Farben had taken over the local plant of Norsk Hydro, the only heavy water manufacturer at the time. In the winter of 1939, Heisenberg had estimated the need for a uranium reactor in 5 cubic tons of heavy water. In the summer of 1941, von Weizsäcker presented the patent for the production of element 94 in an uranium machine. Element 94 is plutonium. In the patent presentation, he described its essential advantage for military applications. With his methods, chemically separating plutonium from the uranium and not through enrichment, which would make its production less complicated. Weizsäcker spoke explicitly about a bomb and explosions. It was the OKH, the Supreme Command of the Army, who registered these procedures in the German Patent Office. The inventors, the scientists, had joined the war machine, and they were not, as they would claim after the war, opponents of the Nazi regime. In that same year, Wirtz filed a patent for a nuclear reactor. Its title,
Production of Technical Energy, Production of Neutrons, and Production of New Elements through the Splitting of Uranium.
Where these patents went after the war was a mystery for a long time. In a publication of the Max Planck Society, successor of the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, they say that they were lost. I insisted on clarification a few years ago. They replied that they did not know about the patents, and they told me to go to the Munich Patent Office. But the Patent Office also claimed that they could not find them.
There are two options. Either the patents were part of the spoils of war and seized during the invasion of the US Army, or they were hidden from the Allies and later, when the Federal Republic was allowed to get involved in nuclear research again, registered as new patents. The last option seems probable.
A publication of the German Patent Office explicitly mentions these seizures by U.S. troops in April and July of 1945. They took pictures of these patents and patent applications, 3,000 photographs per day, and sent them to the United States. Only in the 50s these films, or copies of them, were returned to the Federal Republic of Germany. For this documentary, I contacted the Max Planck Society again, and my lawyer asked the Patent Office for declassification of the papers. Facing the dangers of going to trial, they gave in. I received the desired documents. They proved that the same scientist, Karl Wirtz, who had filed the initial patents in 1941, 14 years later, this time as director of the Max Planck Institute of Physics of Göttingen, went to the Patent Office and presented his invention again as a novelty. This time, not as an application for a uranium machine, but now for an atomic reactor. Of course, for peaceful purposes. As if it had never existed in the military record of the Third Reich. The company Evonik, administrator of the corporate archive of Degussa, explained to me,
It is possible that Karl Wirtz submitted his original patent of 1941 after the war again, under another title, such as a new patent application.
It was not known what happened to the SS General Kammler after the end of the war. There is no trace of his person. It was said that his documents have landed in Argentina. The leather factory Dix in Thuringia had imported leather from Argentina. So, there were well-functioning trade routes to send equipment and papers of Kammler's project in another direction in order to hide them from the Allies. After World War II, most of the scientists from Hitler's military-industrial complex ended up in the United States, some in Argentina. In the province of Tucumán, Walter Seelmann-Eggebert, collaborator of Otto Kahn, and Hans Pflegenheimer were hired by the government of General Juan Domingo Perón, who wanted to construct an atomic research center. Ronald Richter, who had previously worked with Manfred von Ardenne, went to Bariloche and built the center on the Huemul Island. In Córdoba, Kurt Tank, a former designer of the Focke-Wulf factory, worked with 60 German engineers on the project of a remote-controlled bomb, the jet fighter Pulki, and a wind tunnel. Also in Córdoba, Hans Kleiner, director of the FAR and Forja corporations, produced parts for aircrafts. Forja belonged to the powerful Mercedes-Benz Argentine Empire. At the Armament Agency of the Third Reich, Kleiner had directed the main department for aircraft equipment and for the Heineken Company. He had developed jet fighters and fuel for Murol rockets with the labor of the prisoners of concentration camps. The Argentine missiles Condor I and Condor II later emerged from these research efforts in Córdoba. Walter Schnur, formerly with IG Farben, developed explosives for Argentine military productions. After his return to Germany, he became head of department in the Ministry of Atomic Affairs. Unlike the United States, where German scientists had to integrate into the hierarchies of the Army and NASA, in Argentina they had their own technology space, and so they could continue their research. Interrupted in 1945 with the end of the war. After the war, their colleagues in Germany were captured and transferred to Farmhall in the United Kingdom. Chemists Otto Hahn and Paul Hartek, physicist Erich Bache, Horst Gorschin, Karl Friedrich von Weizsäcker, Karl Wirz, Werner Heisenberg, Max von Laue, Walter Gerlach, and Kurt Diebner. In August of 1945, Farmhall got the news of the launching of 2 nuclear bombs on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Although the war in Asia was essentially resolved and the peace negotiations were ongoing, the United States wanted to test its new technology at the last minute, or rather 2 technologies. The plutonium bomb, based on natural uranium and heavy water, that was deployed against Nagasaki, and the bomb with enriched uranium that destroyed Hiroshima. How the Pentagon managed to develop the German technology based on plutonium so quickly remains a mystery. Was it part of the spoils of war of Thuringia? The conversations of the German scientists in England were intercepted and later published. In Farmhall, they invented a legend, claiming they had consciously made the decision not to build the atomic bomb for Hitler. Von Weizsäcker:
We did not succeed because all the physicists basically did not want it to be successful. If we had all wanted Germany to win the war, we would have succeeded.
Heisenberg:
The relationship between the scientists and the German government was such that, on the one hand, we were not 100% convinced, and on the other hand, the authorities had very little trust in us.
Wirz:
I think it's typical for the Germans to make the discovery and not use it, while the Americans used it. I did not think Americans would dare to use it.
Otto Hahn considered the Germans as victims. He said that he himself had wanted the defeat, but he had not imagined such a terrible tragedy for his country. He spoke of our bled land.
I doubt if the behavior of the occupation powers today is much more generous than that of the Germans in the occupied countries.
His former colleague, Lise Meitner, who had escaped from the Nazis by choosing to go into exile in Sweden, wrote to him,
In Poland, 2 million people died. They did not die in the war, but they were killed on purpose.
Meitner added,
You have all worked for Nazi Germany and have never tried to resist, even passively.
Hahn did not answer any more. While he was detained in Farmhall, the Nobel Committee announced the granting of the Chemistry Prize to Hahn for the discovery of nuclear fission. That discovery was not made only by himself, but together with Lise Meitner and Fritz Strassmann in 1938. But Meitner was Jewish and had refused to do research for military purposes. In exile, she also rejected the U.S. offer to participate in the Manhattan Project, the construction of the atomic bomb. And Strassmann's scientific career was hindered by the Nazis because of his critical attitude to the regime. Both were ignored by the Nobel Committee. Hahn, who had served Hitler and saw the Germans as victims, was rewarded. Nuclear research in Germany was put on hold until the founding of the Federal Republic. It started again, slowly, in 1950. Degussa requested the approval of the production of materials and equipment for atomic energy.
Our future activities cannot be used for military purposes.
The company promised to the new German government.
After the American occupation in Frankfurt, our operations were examined by several commissions of the Allies. Our beryllium plant in the French zone was totally dismantled and transported to France.
The year 1955 marks the change. In Argentina, the Perón government had been overthrown by a military coup, and many German scientists left the country. In Germany, the armed forces and an atomic ministry were founded again. The nuclear rearmament was no longer a taboo. In the same year, Degussa founded its nuclear group, of course, only for civilian use. The Treaty of Paris banned the German government from nuclear research for military purposes. But in 1957, the European Atomic Energy Agency, Euratom, was founded, where the Germans could use their scientific knowledge of the Nazi era in close collaboration with the French. The German government denied this in public as a false accusation. Looking at the list of plutonium patents, we can see that only in 1959 the French began to register their inventions, and that in 1960 they finally made their first nuclear test, hand in hand with the Germans. The government in Tel Aviv had not spared efforts for its own nuclear program. In 1949, a year after the founding of the state, the Weizmann Institute for Science in Rehovot was founded, headed by Ernst Bergman, founder of the Israeli Atomic Energy Commission. But it lacked technical knowledge and financial resources. The state budget depended on remittances from the US. At that time, the White House did not want a nuclear power in the Middle East. They even agreed to arms embargo with France and Great Britain. President Eisenhower had close ties with the oil-rich Arab states and was in close contact with anti-colonialist circles in Algeria, to the great displeasure of French who feared the loss of their colonies. The United States wanted to secure its nuclear monopoly and keep the circle of nuclear powers small. U.S. laws prohibit the production of nuclear weapons for other states. For civil research, they provided Israel with enriched uranium under strict security controls. In July 1956, the Soviet Union agreed to assistance in the development of atomic energy with the Egyptian leader Gamal Abdel Nasser. It was about civilian use, but Prime Minister Ben-Gurion feared the worst and asked the French head of the state, Guy Mollet, a socialist and ally of the Israeli Labor Party, for help. The Franco-Israeli Connections of the years 1956 and 57 is quite known, even if there exist very few written documents in the French archives. It was never known that it was not the French, but the Germans who later realized the Israeli nuclear dreams. Obviously, people feel more comfortable with the nice story that the French socialists, victims of the Nazis too, helped the Jewish state rather than accepting the crude reality that it was the right-wing government of Konrad Adenauer, with his former high-ranking members of the Nazi regime, who arranged a dirty deal with the Zionists. The government of Paris needed a strategic partner in the Middle East, especially when it became known that Nasser was planning the nationalization of the Suez Canal. And a strategic partner needs weapons. In April of 1956, the first Mystère fighter aircraft landed in the Holy Land. 3 months later, Nasser announced the nationalization of the canal. Immediately, the French government approved the Israeli wish for arms. A few weeks later, Israeli forces invaded the Gaza Strip and the Sinai Peninsula and pushed forward to the canal. The British and the French Air Force bombed Egyptian airports. The United States did not join the attack, but demanded a ceasefire and Israel's withdrawal from the Sinai. Under protest, Israel withdrew and reminded France of its promise, the construction of the Dimona nuclear plant in the Negev desert, disguised as a textile factory. On the night of November 5th to 6th, 1956, President Mollet decided to help Israel with the atomic bomb, according to a publication of the Vienna Atomic Energy Agency. In October of 1957, the Franco-Israeli Agreement was signed. Of course, Washington became aware of it. The U-2 spy planes passed over the construction site, and Eisenhower pressured Charles de Gaulle, who took office in 1958, as the new French Prime Minister. De Gaulle was never satisfied with the nuclear agreement of his socialist predecessor Mollet, which endangered his own nuclear weapons program and which needed the support of his American friends. De Gaulle announced to the Israeli Prime Minister Ben-Gurion that the Dimona agreement was terminated if there was no absolute certainty that the nuclear plant would be subject to international controls. But he gave him some warm advice. He should knock on the door of the Germans. The Minister of Atomic Affairs, Franz Joseph Strauss, had negotiated a secret treaty with the French to build a European nuclear industry, which included a military option. But German support for the secret construction of an Israeli weapon of mass destruction was impossible without a green light from above. Ben-Gurion needed a direct contact with the Chancellor Adenauer and called Joseph Kahn, a fundraiser for the Weizmann Institute in Rehovot. Kahn first contacted business leaders, the Bayer Chemical Corporation and Hermann Joseph Abs of the Deutsche Bank, who was in close contact with the Atomic Ministry. At that time, diplomatic relations between Bonn and Tel Aviv still did not exist. But Adenauer wanted to return to the international stage and normalize his young state. Therefore, he had to solve in some way the problem of the Holocaust, the extermination of the Jews during the Third Reich, to make it seem as if his new federal republic had nothing to do with it. He realized that this was only possible with the consent of the Israeli government, and Ben-Gurion accepted the deal. Kahn used the right words when he considered the transfer of German technology, a constructive contribution to reduce anti-Semitism. On December 1st, 1959, Kahn, the nuclear physicist Wolfgang Gettner, and the president of the Max Planck Society, Otto Hahn, traveled to Israel. For 10 days, the delegation of senior German nuclear scientists visited the Weizmann Institute in Rehovot. The Israelis did not care that Hahn and Gettner had been involved in Hitler's uranium club. Hahn was really excited. Rehovot reminded him of the optimism of the founding era of the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute in Berlin. That was the first step. Ben-Gurion needed a lot of money for his plans. In February of 1960, the president of the World Jewish Congress wrote to the German chancellor,
"The decision that your cabinet will take this week will have far-reaching consequences for Israeli attitudes and German-Jewish relations. You know how much I care that the relationship between Jews and Germans returns to normal."
Adenauer understood and he complied. On March 2, 1960, his cabinet approved the payment of 3 million German marks for scientific cooperation with Israel. It was not a coincidence that the money came from the budget of the Atomic Ministry. Referring to the documents, they spoke openly about the production of heavy water and uranium. But where would the uranium come from? In Bonn, the Adenauer boys remembered the old comrades in Argentina.
The Weizmann Institute participates successfully in the treatment of enriched heavy water and has, in this field, a type of research contract with the Argentine Atomic Commission.
With the 3 million German marks, Adenauer showed his goodwill. However, that sum was not enough for a reactor capable of producing material for nuclear weapons. This financing was negotiated 12 days later, on March 14, 1960, in New York. The Operation Commercial Friend began. The meeting between Adenauer and Ben-Gurion had been organized by Kahn. A harmonious meeting, wrote the press.
A representative of the people of the victims and a representative of the people of the authors of the crimes are sitting together like old friends at a small coffee table, smiling affably, exchanging lovely gestures and shaking hands.
In public, Ben-Gurion praised his new friends as a different generation.
The previous generation, that was Hitler.
His words landed immediately at the desk of the German government. Adenauer was satisfied. In his speech, Ben-Gurion did not mention the old Nazi comrades in the state apparatus of Bonn.
Today there are few Nazis left. Israel must acquire the friendship of the new Germany today.
Many years later, it was reported that at this meeting in New York, Adenauer agreed to grant Ben-Gurion a loan of 2 billion German marks for the development of the Negev Desert, that is, for the construction of the Dimona nuclear power plant. The money was secretly sent aside in addition to the amounts Germany paid in reparation. At my request, the German Ministry of Foreign Affairs declassified the files of the Operation Commercial Friend. The head of the Deutsche Bank, Abs, wanted to limit the amount and charge interest.
At the meeting in New York on March 14, 1960, the German Chancellor and Ben-Gurion talked, among other things, about aid for the development of Israel. The the Chancellor granted a loan of 200 million Deutschmarks, paid annually for a period of 10 years on a commercial basis. In this context, they held further discussions with the Chancellor, Minister Ludwig Erhard, and Undersecretary of State Hans Globke, which concluded with an agreement according to which a first payment for this year, in total 85 million marks, will be transferred in June or July.
Undersecretary Karl Carstens commented in a top-secret note.
Minister Strauss has met Ben-Gurion a few days ago. Ben-Gurion has spoken about the production of nuclear weapons. In the conversation, Ben-Gurion said that the Chancellor had promised him that the Federal Republic would participate in the development of the Negev Desert.
However, Carstens proposed to wait with the payment until the end of the trial against Adolf Eichmann in Jerusalem. Adenauer wanted to make sure that Ben-Gurion would stick to the agreement and avoid accusing his government of Nazism. Ben-Gurion adhered to the pact.
The Israeli government wants to prevent the Soviet bloc from using the process against Eichmann to create propaganda. It intends to base the whole process on documentary evidence and reduce the number of testimonies.
Hans Globke, former commentator of the racial laws of Nuremberg and then powerful Undersecretary of State in Adenauer's government, assured an orderly execution. On October 31st, 1961, Globke received from the head of the German State Bank, KfW, the draft contract with the Industrial Development Bank of Israel on the first payment of 85 million German marks for infrastructure projects and industrial development, as it was elegantly phrased. Meanwhile, Adenauer informed his Minister of Economy about the operation in progress. The ministry acted in a conspirative way.
In the matter of a commercial friend of Cologne that we discussed some time ago, with the result of a payment of 83 marks, a new meeting seems necessary. It would be useful to join the same little circle that dealt with the matter the last time.
The little circle came together.
Today, Ambassador Schinner gave me a copy of a note presented to Undersecretary of State Hans Globke, requesting a second share of 100 million in aid for Israel's development. Mr. Globke will be in charge of taking the necessary steps.
The German Foreign Ministry never completely approved of the Operation Commercial Friend.
There are no conclusive documents on the conversation conducted by the Chancellor in New York. The other party confirmed the content of the conversation by letter, as he understood it, but a confirmation from the German side is not available. A letter from the other party is supposedly held by Mr. Abs. The legal situation raises many questions. On one hand, under constitutional law, the Chancellor cannot assume financial obligations for 10 years without the authorization of his cabinet, in particular without the finance minister and without the parliament. I do not think that the Chancellor understood the conversation in that way.
In 1965, the operation came to an end. Adenauer had resigned, and with him, Globke. Diplomatic relations between Israel and Germany were established. Embassies had been opened. In total, the KfW Bank was paid 630 million German marks to the commercial friend. The bank confirmed this payment, but pretended that it did not have a single document about the operation.
Only very few employees of KfW knew that we had granted annually, since 1961, loans to Israel in the framework of the secret operation Commercial Friend.
According to the bank, the action has been an exception. When I asked if they charged interest on this loan, they replied,
As a federal bank, KfW carries out the decisions of the government as the mentioned Operation Commercial Friend. We ask your understanding, considering we cannot comment publicly on such transactions.
The biggest problems, money and technology, were solved by the Israelis, thanks to the German government. Still lacking were heavy water and uranium. The US Atomic Energy Agency, AEC, had received information from all sides about the nuclear activities of the Israelis. The Atomic Commissions of Tel Aviv had requested the delivery of heavy water, necessary for obtaining plutonium. but the AEC had refused, because the government of Ben-Gurion did not want to be subject to security regulations. After this negative response, the Israelis contacted the director of the Norwegian Nuclear Authority, Noratom, on August 9, 1957. They urgently needed heavy water for a 40-kilowatt reactor.
For the development and production of plutonium for Israel's future nuclear power plants.
Plutonium is needed exclusively for military purposes, and of course, the Norwegians knew it. But instead of refusing to hand over the substance, they started a game of diplomatic ping-pong until Israel stated its intentions to use heavy water only for peaceful purposes. And that was enough. However, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Oslo officially informed the AEC about the Israeli order of 20 tons of heavy water to Norsk Hydro, but the United States let the delivery happen. The British intelligence service also learned of the sale of 20 tons of heavy water. It estimated that with this amount, Israel could build 6 nuclear weapons a year, provided that it received uranium. Dimona received uranium, again officially in 1960, from Argentina, with German help and with knowledge of the United States. These documents are not even secret in Buenos Aires. The Argentine Atomic Commissions, CONEA, delivered the first 5 tons to the Israelis through the German companies Metallgesellschaft and Nukem, a subsidiary of the Degussa. I asked Degussa why they produced the uranium oxide, the yellow cake, for the Israelis in 1960. The company did not answer that question. I was allowed to examine their archives only until 1950. 2 years later, additional 10 metric tons of uranium oxide in the form of uranium concentrate were delivered directly to the Holy Land. I also found these decisions in the National Archive of Argentina, and in 1963, Buenos Aires sent more than 100 tons of yellow cake directly to Israel. These supplies appeared in official trade statistics and were shared by CONEA with the United States liaison officer. But the AEC did nothing. The Commission did not protest, and even signed a new atomic agreement with Argentina, as a reward, you might say. At the end of September 1963, the Germans informed the U.S. government about their technical assistance for Israel.
We informed President Kennedy about our measures in an absolutely confidential way.
Kennedy had repeatedly asked Ben-Gurion to allow an international commission to check the Dimona complex. In November 1963, he was assassinated. And from that moment on, no other president of the United States interfered with the Israeli nuclear bomb. Not even the International Atomic Energy Agency in Vienna. In 1986, the Dimona technician Mordecai Vanunu described in detail to the international press the underground installations of the nuclear power plant where nuclear-grade material is produced. But no government demanded an explanation. They even kept silent when Vanunu was kidnapped by the Mossad from Italy to Israel. He was imprisoned there for 18 years, and until today he cannot move freely or give interviews. Vanunu only said what the intelligence services had already known and tolerated. The Germans continued to provide technology and capital for Israel's nuclear weapons. In 1968, they allowed the freighter Schießberg, which was to deliver 200 tons of uranium oxide to Italy, to be redirected by the Mossad to Israel, where the material disappeared. The German Security Council approved the export and financing of 6 Dolphin submarines built by ThyssenKrupp in Kiel. The Israeli army wants to equip them with nuclear weapons. To the public, this is justified by the historical responsibility of the Germans towards Israel. This responsibility exists, but it should never lead them to collaborate in the production of weapons of mass destruction. Israel's conventional armed forces guarantee the country's safety and are far superior to those of their potential opponents. The country does not need a nuclear bomb, and particularly not a bomb that came out from the Nazi womb.